My sister accidentally added me to a secret family group chat. The name of the group was Christmas Prep No Maya. I sat there and watched the messages roll in one by one. My mother wrote to make sure I did not find out because they were planning to sell the family house to fund a new business. My brother-in-law replied that they should just tell me the wrong date like last year so I would not show up. I did not shed a single tear. I screenshotted every single message. Then I sent one reply to the group. Merry Christmas. Your realtor will explain the rest. I closed the chat and opened my laptop to look at the official county deed to that exact house. The deed with my name on it. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. I am Maya. I am 33 years old, and I work as a forensic accountant. My entire career is built on tracking missing money and uncovering financial fraud. I spend my days dismantling lies constructed by very desperate and very greedy people. I am extremely good at what I do. I was sitting at the sleek glass desk in my downtown office reviewing a complex corporate audit report when my phone buzzed. It was an invitation to a new group chat. I looked at the bright screen and read the group name again. Christmas Prep No Maya. My older sister Chloe had always been incredibly sloppy with technology. She was 35 years old and still acted like the golden child who could do no wrong. She had clearly synced her new phone contacts incorrectly and accidentally added my personal work number instead of her wedding planner or one of her friends. I sat perfectly still and watched the gray typing bubbles appear in real time. Chloe sent the very first message. She asked if Chad had secured the property appraiser yet. She typed that they desperately needed the house sold by January at the absolute latest. Chad is her husband. He is a 36-year-old finance guy who loves to remind everyone in our family that he went to a prestigious, predominantly white Ivy League university. He has always viewed our family with a thin veil of pure arrogance. His reply popped up on my screen a few seconds later. He told Chloe that he had the entire situation completely handled. Then he added a specific and cruel instruction. He wrote that they absolutely should not invite Maya to the house under any circumstances. He complained that the last time we were together, I had the nerve to bring up my accounting degree from Howard University, and I dared to debate his hedge fund strategies. He actually typed the exact words that my degree was embarrassing compared to his elite background. He said I was socially unfit for his high-profile circles. My chest tightened, but my breathing remained perfectly steady. I watched the typing indicator bubble up again on the screen. This time it was my mother, Bernadette. My mother is a woman who cares more about her pristine image at the church than she cares about her own children. She is the absolute queen of respectability politics, always making sure she looks utterly perfect for the pastor and the affluent church ladies. Her message appeared on the screen, and it felt like a heavy physical blow to my stomach. She wrote that she would just tell the church congregation that I was working overseas again. She typed that they simply could not have me around asking annoying questions about the property or the real estate market. Then she added the ultimate toxic justification. She wrote that Chad needed this capital to launch his new investment firm, and the family needed to sacrifice to help him succeed. She ended her long message with the phrase, "Family comes first." Family comes first. That is the ultimate lie toxic families use to justify financial abuse and manipulation. In our community, they call it the black tax. It is the unspoken and heavy expectation that the successful independent child must carry the financial burdens of the irresponsible golden children. But this specific situation was worse than just asking for money. They were actively plotting to sell the home I grew up in, to fund the lavish lifestyle of an arrogant man who constantly belittled my education and my hard-earned accomplishments. They truly thought I was just the difficult middle child who asked way too many questions. They completely forgot what I do for a living. They forgot that I track assets and uncover deception every single day. I did not cry. Crying is a biological response for people who do not have any leverage or power. I took a slow and calculated breath to calm my racing heart. I reached forward and opened a highly secured folder on my computer desktop. The encrypted file was labeled Oak Heritage Holdings LLC. It contained the original legal property deed to my parents' massive suburban home. They had absolutely no idea that I owned the private company that held their deed for the past 4 years. They had no idea they were actively plotting to illegally sell a house they did not even own anymore. The ultimate trap was perfectly set, and they were walking right into it with their arrogant eyes wide open. I knew exactly what I had to do now. I stood up from my desk and grabbed my car keys. I adjusted my designer blazer and prepared to drive directly to the house. I was finally ready to face them all and shatter their perfect little illusion of control. This was going to be the most satisfying holiday of my entire life. My fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced precision. Command-Shift-4. The screenshot shutter sound clicked like a camera capturing a crime scene. I dragged the selection box over Chad mocking my Howard University degree. Click. I dragged the box over Chloe demanding to know if the appraiser had been secured. Click. I took a final screenshot of my mother planning to lie to the entire church congregation just to keep me away from my own property. Click went the shutter. I saved every single image into a newly created folder on my desktop labeled Evidence. I stared at the group chat for another moment, watching the typing bubbles dance as they continued to plan their perfect holiday funded by my stolen asset. They were so consumed by greed they had not even realized my name was listed at the top. I moved my cursor to the text box. I did not type a paragraph expressing my hurt. I did not demand an explanation or ask why I was being treated like a pariah. Forensic accountants know that less is always more when you are building a case. I typed a single sentence. Merry Christmas. Your realtor will explain the rest. I finally hit send. Without waiting for a single reply, I immediately tapped the red button that said Leave Group. The chat vanished from my screen. The silence in my office lasted exactly 9 seconds. I counted them in my head while taking a sip of my black coffee. On the 10th second, my phone began to vibrate violently across the surface of my glass desk. The caller identification flashed with a picture of my mother smiling in her Sunday church hat. I let it ring 3 times before I reached out and tapped the green accept button. I pressed speakerphone and set the device down. How dare you spy on our private family conversation? Bernadette screamed so loudly, the speaker on my phone actually crackled. Her voice trembled with indignant rage, completely bypassing any shame for getting caught. You have absolutely no right to be lurking in the shadows and reading things that do not concern you. I leaned back and smoothed a crease from my dark trousers. You added me first, Mother. You created the group and you added my number. I kept my voice cold and completely devoid of emotion. Just like you added my primary credit card to your Amazon account last month without asking me. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. I pressed the advantage, refusing to let her mount a defense. You charged $800 for matching cashmere sweaters for Chloe and Chad. You called it a blessing from the Lord when you handed them the boxes last Sunday at family dinner. The Lord did not buy those sweaters, Mother. I bought them and I already flagged the charges as fraudulent with my bank. You are my daughter. Bernadette shrieked, her voice pitching higher as she deployed her favorite weapon of maternal guilt. I carried you for 9 months. I raised you in the church. You owe me respect. The Bible says to honor your mother and father, but you only care about money. You are completely obsessed with hoarding your little paychecks, while your sister is trying to build a real future. Chad needs this capital. I is a provider doing what a real man is supposed to do for his family. Chad is a fraud, I replied flatly, and you are a willing accomplice. Before Bernadette could launch into another sermon about respectability and family loyalty, there was a scuffling sound on the line. I heard the phone being yanked away. Listen to me, you bitter, lonely woman. Chloe sneered into the receiver. Her voice carried that distinct tone of absolute superiority she had perfected since childhood. You are just jealous. You have always been jealous of me. You are mad because Chad is a real provider who takes care of his wife while you sit in a cubicle crunching numbers for a living. You are trying to ruin my Christmas because you do not have a man of your own. I pulled up her bank records. The numbers told a very different story about her real provider of a husband, but I was not ready to drop that specific bomb just yet. I let her rant. We are selling that house and there is absolutely nothing you can do about it. Chloe laughed a harsh, condescending sound. Mom and Dad gave Chad the power of attorney. He handled all the legal paperwork today. It is a done deal, Maya. So take your little screenshots and cry about it to your cats. Oh wait, you do not even have cats. I smiled at my computer monitor. The power of attorney Chad drafted was completely useless. He had essentially forged a document to sell a house my parents no longer owned. Just stay away from the house tomorrow. Chloe ordered, her voice dropping into a threatening whisper. We are hosting a very important event. Pastor Jenkins and the entire church board are coming over for our annual Christmas tea. Chad is pitching a new investment portfolio to the church deacons, and we need everything to be absolutely perfect. Do not even think about showing your face and embarrassing us with your miserable attitude. You are not welcome in our home. Our home. The audacity of the phrase almost made me laugh out loud. She was standing in a house I had secretly saved from foreclosure 4 years ago, confidently banishing me from my own property. I picked up the phone, bringing the microphone closer to my mouth. I kept my voice incredibly soft and completely terrifying. I will see you at 2 in the afternoon, Chloe. Make sure the pastor brings his reading glasses. He is going to want to see the paperwork. I ended the call before she could speak again. I grabbed my leather briefcase from my desk and took the private elevator down to the parking garage. My car was a matte black luxury sedan. It was quiet, understated, and completely paid for. I did not need flashy logos or obnoxious exhaust pipes to prove my net worth. Chad drove a leased sports car that guzzled premium gas he could barely afford. The drive to the suburbs took exactly 45 minutes. I used the time to mentally review the property records I had memorized that morning. The neighborhood where I grew up was filled with manicured lawns and aging colonial houses. It was the kind of place where people cared more about what the neighbors thought than what was actually happening inside their own walls. I pulled into the driveway and parked right behind Chad's leased vehicle. I did not bother ringing the doorbell. I turned the brass knob and pushed the heavy wooden door open, stepping directly into the foyer. The living room was suffocatingly warm and smelled heavily of floral perfume and freshly baked scones. My mother was holding court. 6 women from the church board sat arranged on the expensive velvet sofas. They wore their Sunday best on a Tuesday afternoon, complete with intricate fascinators and perfectly pressed suits. These were the gatekeepers of our local community. They were the women who judged your entire existence based on your church attendance and your husband's job title. Bernadette was standing by the silver tea service, pouring Earl Grey into delicate porcelain cups. She was mid-sentence, likely bragging about Chad's fictional hedge fund success, when the heavy oak door clicked shut behind me. The entire room went completely silent. 6 pairs of judgmental eyes snapped toward the foyer. My mother froze. The silver teapot trembled slightly in her grip, rattling against the saucer. She had clearly spent the entire morning constructing a flawless narrative about why her youngest daughter was missing from the holiday festivities. Now the villain of her story was standing right in her pristine living room. Maya, she gasped, forcing a wide, painfully artificial smile onto her face. Her voice pitched an octave higher than normal, completely drenched in fake Southern hospitality. What a wonderful surprise. I thought you were still in Dubai closing that massive corporate audit for your firm. She looked at the church ladies, silently begging them to buy her ridiculous lie. She was trying to frame my absence as the result of a highly successful, glamorous career choice rather than a deliberate family exclusion. It was the ultimate display of respectability politics. She would rather invent an international business trip than admit her own family was fractured. I walked slowly into the living room. My heels clicked rhythmically against the hardwood floor. I did not return her fake smile. I looked around the room, taking in the carefully arranged holiday decorations and the expensive floral centerpieces. I unbuttoned my tailored blazer and slipped it off my shoulders. I walked right past the antique coat rack and casually dropped my jacket directly onto a set of custom golf clubs leaning against the wall. They belonged to Chad. I am not in Dubai, Mother, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and conversational. I did not fly halfway across the world. I drove 45 minutes from downtown. I wanted to make sure I was right here in the house where I personally pay the property taxes every single quarter. Someone in the room gasped loudly. It sounded like Sister Margaret, the head of the usher board. The teacup in my mother's hand slipped and clattered violently against the silver tray. A few drops of hot tea spilled onto the expensive Persian rug. Bernadette's face drained of all color. The carefully applied blush on her cheeks suddenly looked harsh and clownish. "Maya, please," she hissed through clenched teeth, her eyes darting frantically towards the church ladies. "We have guests. We are discussing the holiday charity drive. You are being completely inappropriate. This is a private family matter." "You stopped making this a private family matter the second you invited strangers into my living room," I replied. "You cannot exclude me from the family text thread and then use my property to host your high society tea parties. You do not get to banish me from the premises while you drink tea under a roof I secured." The silence in the room became thick and suffocating. The church ladies were completely paralyzed, their eyes wide with shock. For years, Bernadette had painted a picture of a perfect household. She had bragged about Chloe marrying a brilliant finance genius and quietly sighed about my refusal to settle down. Now the reality of their financial situation was being laid bare in front of her most important audience. "Maya, that is quite enough." A deep, arrogant voice echoed from the hallway. I turned to see Chad stepping out of my father's home office. He wore a crisp navy suit with a ridiculously expensive tie. He held a crystal glass of bourbon in one hand and a thick manila folder in the other. He looked exactly like a man who believed he owned the entire world simply because he had been born into the right demographic. His white privilege radiated from him like a toxic cologne. He stepped into the living room and offered a charming, apologetic smile to the church ladies, completely dismissing my presence. "I am so sorry for the interruption, ladies," Chad said smoothly. "My sister-in-law has a habit of making dramatic entrances. She gets a little confused about how adult finances actually work." He turned his gaze to me. His blue eyes were cold and full of condescending pity. He took a slow sip of his bourbon. He enjoyed this moment, savoring the chance to put the arrogant black woman in her place. "Actually, Maya, you do not. Marcus and Bernadette just signed the power of attorney over to me." Chad tapped the thick manila folder against his palm, like a judge handing down a final sentence. He walked past me and stood directly in the center of the living room, making sure he had the full attention of every single woman sitting on the velvet sofas. He flashed his blindingly white practice smile. "Listen, Maya," he said, using a calm tone reserved for explaining arithmetic to a toddler. "I know you run numbers, but this is about high-level liquidity. This house is an illiquid asset. It is just sitting here doing absolutely nothing for Marcus and Bernadette. I am simply moving the parents' equity into my high-yield portfolio. It is basic Ivy League economics. I would not expect you to understand it with your little historically black college background." He took another sip of his bourbon. His confidence was suffocating. He actually believed his Wharton degree made him untouchable in this room. He turned to Sister Margaret, giving her a reassuring nod. "We are just maximizing the family portfolio, ladies. Ensuring my in-laws can retire in absolute luxury." Bernadette practically beamed with pride at his words. She smoothed her expensive skirt and looked at the church board members, hoping they were impressed by her son-in-law, using terms like equity and high-yield portfolio. My mother always craved the validation of white wealth. She thought having Chad in the family elevated her status above the rest of the congregation. I unclasped my leather briefcase and pulled out my iPad. The screen was already glowing with the banking records I had intercepted less than an hour ago. I swiped past his generic corporate filings and pulled up the hidden offshore accounts he thought were completely untraceable. I walked right up to Chad. I did not flinch. I did not lower my gaze. I looked him dead in his pale blue eyes. "Liquidity, Chad?" I asked, my voice echoing off the high ceilings of the living room. "Is that the word we are using now?" Chad stopped smiling. His jaw tightened, but he tried to maintain his arrogant posture. I tapped the glass screen of my iPad. "Liquidity is a fascinating concept." I continued pacing slowly in front of the sofas. Like how you liquidated $250,000 from your clients' escrow accounts last month, Chad. Is that the kind of high-yield portfolio strategy they teach at your elite university? The collective gasp from the church ladies sucked all the oxygen out of the room. Sister Margaret dropped her tea sandwich directly onto her lap. Another woman actually clutched her pearl necklace in genuine shock. In the Black church community, there is no currency more valuable than a pristine reputation. Bernadette had spent decades building hers, and Chad was supposed to be the crowning jewel of her social climbing efforts. Now his shiny veneer was cracking right in front of the entire usher board. Bernadette leaped up from her chair. Maya, she screamed, her voice cracking with pure panic. Shut your mouth right now! How dare you make up such vicious lies about your brother-in-law in front of company? Chad was sweating. A thin layer of moisture appeared on his forehead. He gripped his bourbon glass so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. You do not know what you are talking about, he stammered, taking a quick step back. Those are corporate funds. They were temporarily reallocated for a bridge loan. It is a standard financial maneuver. You would not understand the complexity of my operations. You transferred client escrow funds into a personal offshore gambling account. Chad, I replied, pulling up the exact wire transfer receipt on my screen and turning it so the church ladies could see the staggering negative balances. You lost $100,000 on offshore sports betting in a single weekend. The rest went to cover margin calls on your failing shell companies. You are not a brilliant hedge fund manager. You are a degenerate gambler drowning in federal wire fraud. Before Chad could even attempt to formulate another lie, the sound of heavy footsteps pounded down the hallway staircase. Chloe rushed into the living room. She was wearing a silk designer robe and her hair was perfectly styled. She had clearly been listening from the upstairs landing, waiting for Chad to put me in my place. But when she saw Chad sweating, and the church ladies staring at him in absolute horror, she completely snapped. The pristine image she had constructed for herself was collapsing, and she needed someone to blame. Chloe stormed over to the tea service cart. Her hands were shaking with pure, unadulterated rage. She grabbed a porcelain teacup filled to the brim with scalding hot Earl Grey. You are a liar, Maya, she shrieked at the top of her lungs. You are nothing but a jealous, bitter liar. She hurled the teacup directly at my face. I stepped sharply to the left. The cup sailed past my shoulder and shattered violently against the custom golf clubs I had thrown my coat over. Hot tea splashed across the pristine walls and dripped onto the hardwood floor. The church ladies shrieked and scrambled backward on the velvet sofas, trying to avoid the flying shards of porcelain. Chloe did not care that she had just assaulted me in front of the most prominent women in their social circle. She marched forward, pointing a manicured finger right at my chest. You are a liar, she screamed, her voice echoing off the walls. You have always tried to ruin my happiness because you are miserable. You cannot stand the fact that he chose me. You are a liar. You are just jealous. I married a wealthy white man while you are single. You want my life so badly you are making up fake bank records to destroy my marriage. Get out of this house before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing. I did not move a single inch toward the door. I stared at Chloe as she stood there breathing heavily with her chest heaving up and down. Her face was contorted with a very ugly and very desperate rage. The hot tea dripped steadily from the wall onto the expensive Persian rug. Call the police, Chloe. I challenged her, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. Tell the emergency dispatcher you want to report the legal owner of this property for standing in her own foyer. Tell them to bring their financial fraud unit while they are at it, so we can hand over your husband's offshore bank statements and his illegal gambling records. Heavy footsteps pounded on the hardwood stairs, echoing loudly through the tense silence of the foyer. My father Marcus descended into the living room. He wore his signature tailored slacks and a cashmere cardigan, looking every bit the distinguished elder of our community. He took in the chaotic scene before him. He saw the shattered porcelain teacup on the floor. He saw the hot liquid dripping down the pristine wallpaper. He saw Chloe trembling with unhinged fury and Chad sweating profusely through his custom suit. He saw me standing perfectly composed with my iPad in my hand. He did not ask if I was burned. He did not reprimand his eldest daughter for throwing a dangerous projectile at my head. He marched straight toward me with his jaw set in a rigid line of absolute fury. "You always ruin everything, Maya," my father bellowed, his voice bouncing off the high ceilings. "You could not just let us have one peaceful afternoon. You had to come here and spread your toxic poison. Chad is taking care of this family. He is building a real legacy for us, while you do absolutely nothing but tear us down. You never contribute to this household. You just sit in your ivory tower judging us and causing problems." I felt a cold, calculating calm wash over my entire body. I looked at the man who had spent my entire life making me feel like a financial burden and an emotional disappointment. I pulled up another document on my glowing iPad screen. It was a heavily redacted but highly official federal form. I held the device up high so he could clearly see the unmistakable bold seal of the Internal Revenue Service. "I paid off your IRS tax lien in 2022. Dad," I said loudly enough for every single church board member to hear. "You owed the federal government $85,000 in back taxes because you brazenly lied on your corporate business deductions. You were exactly 3 weeks away from facing a federal indictment and having this very house seized by the government." Sister Margaret let out a loud, dramatic gasp and physically fanned her face with a folded church bulletin she pulled from her purse. Bernadette let out a strangled whimper and covered her face with both of her hands, sinking deeper into the velvet sofa. The respectable Addams family was completely unraveling in real time right in front of the exact people they sought to impress. "You stood at the pulpit that following Sunday, Dad," I continued, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the room. "You wept fake tears, and you told the entire church congregation that you had received a miraculous financial blessing from the Lord. You told them God had rewarded your faithfulness with a sudden influx of capital to save your business." I took a deliberate step closer to him, forcing him to look me directly in the eye. "The Lord's name was Maya. I emptied my entire stock portfolio to keep you out of federal prison. I bought the deed to this house through my private company, so the government could not touch your primary residence. I am the blessing. I am the contributor." Marcus opened his mouth, but absolutely no words came out. His distinguished patriarch persona dissolved in a matter of seconds. He looked like a deflated and terrified old man, caught in a web of his own arrogant deception. He looked at the church ladies, who were now whispering fiercely among themselves. Their eyes were full of harsh judgment. "In our community there is no currency more valuable than a pristine reputation, and my father had just lost his entire life savings of social capital." Chad tried to salvage the remaining shreds of his dignity. He puffed out his chest and stepped between me and my father, trying to play the heroic protector. He waved the forged power of attorney document in the air like a white flag of surrender. "This is absolute nonsense," he declared, his voice shaking slightly as he tried to regain his footing. "Marcus and Bernadette are the legal residents of this address. They signed the equity over to me this morning. I have the legal authority to liquidate this asset and secure our financial future." "You cannot liquidate an asset they do not own, Chad," I explained slowly, as if I were speaking to a very slow child. "My company, Oak Heritage Holdings, owns this property. My parents are merely tenants. They have been living here rent-free because I allowed it. That piece of paper you are holding in your shaking hand is completely worthless. You convinced my parents to sign over a house they lost the legal rights to 4 years ago. You are a terrible finance guy and an even worse con artist." The reality of the situation hit the room like a physical shockwave. Chloe sank onto the arm of the velvet sofa, staring at Chad with wide, panicked eyes. She was finally realizing that her wealthy provider was actually a desperate man drowning in gambling debts and facing serious wire fraud charges. The designer bags and leased sports cars were all a massive illusion. Bernadette was crying silently, her pristine makeup completely ruined by her tears. The church board members were already texting furiously under the table, no doubt spreading the scandalous news to every prayer circle and choir member in the county. I stood in the center of the wreckage I had carefully orchestrated. I felt no guilt. I felt absolutely no remorse. I had spent 33 years swallowing my pride and shrinking myself to make this family feel tall. I had funded their lavish lifestyle, fixed their criminal mistakes, and absorbed their constant insults. I was the scapegoat they relied on for survival. Today the Bank of Maya was permanently closed. Just as the heavy silence settled over the ruined living room, the sharp chime of the front doorbell echoed through the foyer. It rang twice, a brisk professional sound that cut right through the thick tension. Chad snapped his head toward the door. A sudden, desperate smirk crawled across his sweating face. He desperately wanted to believe he still had the upper hand. He adjusted his silk tie and stood a little taller, trying to reclaim his shattered authority. "That is the appraiser," Chad announced, puffing out his chest and stepping toward the hallway. He looked at me with a pathetic attempt at intimidation. "Time for you to leave, Maya. We have property to sell." Chad grabbed the brass handle of the heavy front door and yanked it open with an exaggerated flourish. He smoothed the lapels of his custom suit and plastered on his most charming corporate smile. He was absolutely desperate to regain control of the narrative in front of the church board members. He needed to prove he was the wealthy, capable provider he claimed to be. He stepped back to allow the appraiser into the foyer, puffing out his chest and preparing to issue a rapid-fire list of arrogant demands. The woman who walked through the door was striking. She wore a tailored emerald green suit that fit her perfectly. Her silk press was flawless, and her posture radiated absolute authority. She carried a sleek leather portfolio tucked under one arm. Her heels clicked sharply against the hardwood floor, echoing the exact same rhythm mine had when I first entered the house. Chad immediately went into his patronizing finance bro routine. He extended a hand, expecting her to fawn over his leased luxury vehicle in the driveway and his expensive tie. "Ah, you must be the appraiser from Sterling Real Estate," Chad said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Right on time. I appreciate punctuality in my vendors. I am Chad Blackwood, the portfolio manager, handling the liquidation of this estate. I need you to focus your evaluation heavily on the updated kitchen fixtures and the newly landscaped backyard. We are looking for a highly aggressive market valuation to expedite a cash sale. I have investors waiting, so let us keep this moving quickly." The appraiser did not take his outstretched hand. She did not even look at him. She bypassed Chad completely, leaving his hand hovering awkwardly in the empty air. Her sharp brown eyes scanned the chaotic living room. She took in the sight of the shattered teacup on the floor. She noticed the hot Earl Grey dripping down the pristine wallpaper. She looked at Bernadette weeping silently into her hands, and Marcus standing frozen like a hollow statue. She glanced at the terrified church ladies huddled together on the velvet sofas. Finally, her eyes locked directly onto mine, and a slow, brilliant smile spread across her face. "Hey, Maya," she said, her voice warm and entirely unbothered by the sheer panic radiating through the room. "Is this the asset we discussed?" I smiled back, feeling a deep wave of genuine satisfaction. "Hello, Nia," I replied smoothly. "Yes, this is the property. Take your time looking around. The foundation is solid, but the current occupants have caused quite a bit of superficial damage today." Nia was not just a random appraiser. We had shared a cramped brick dorm room during our freshman year at Howard University. We had survived on cheap ramen noodles and instant coffee while staying awake until 4 in the morning to study for our respective exams. While I was mastering corporate audits and financial fraud, Nia was memorizing building codes and market valuations. She was now one of the most ruthless, highly sought-after commercial and residential appraisers on the entire East Coast. Chad had spent the afternoon mocking my historically black college education. He had absolutely no idea that the very same institution had produced the two women who were currently dismantling his entire fake empire. Chad's face turned an ugly, blotchy shade of crimson. His fake corporate charm instantly evaporated. He realized he was losing control of the room again, and his fragile ego simply could not handle being ignored by a black woman he viewed as the hired help. He stepped quickly between Nia and me, physically trying to block our line of sight. He glared at Nia with pure venom. "Excuse me," Chad barked, his voice echoing loudly in the foyer. "I am speaking to you. I am the one directing this transaction. I did not hire you to chat with my disgruntled sister-in-law. I explicitly called Sterling Real Estate this morning. I spoke directly to a senior managing partner and demanded their top agent. You work for me. Now get your notepad out and start walking the perimeter of the house before I call your boss and have you fired for gross insubordination." Nia slowly turned her head to look at Chad. The expression on her face was a mixture of clinical fascination and absolute pity. She looked at him the way a scientist might look at a particularly foolish insect trapped in a jar. She adjusted her grip on her leather portfolio and let out a soft, elegant laugh. "I think you are deeply confused about the corporate hierarchy here, Chad," Nia said, her voice perfectly calm and devastatingly sharp. "You did call Sterling Real Estate. You demanded our top agent. But you see, Sterling Real Estate is a wholly owned subsidiary of Oak Heritage Holdings. Maya is the majority shareholder and the chief executive officer of the parent company. She owns the firm you called. She sent me here to evaluate her personal asset because you are attempting to illegally sell a house she already owns. I do not work for you, Chad. I work for Maya." The remaining air was instantly sucked out of the room. Sister Margaret let out a soft, wheezing sound and slumped back against the sofa cushions. Bernadette buried her face deeper into her hands, letting out a loud, muffled sob. Chloe was violently trembling, her eyes darting back and forth between Chad and Nia as her entire reality crumbled into dust. My father stared blankly at the floor, completely defeated by the sheer magnitude of his own humiliation. The elitist church ladies who had spent decades judging other families for their minor flaws were now securing front-row seats to the greatest financial scandal in the history of their congregation. Chad completely lost his mind. His brain simply short-circuited. His toxic pride and his desperate need to be the smartest man in the room refused to let him accept the reality of his failure. He was drowning in debt and facing federal charges, and his only life raft had just been set on fire. He turned bright purple. Sweat poured down his face, ruining the collar of his expensive custom shirt. He frantically waved the thick manila folder in the air. He ripped open the flap and pulled out the legal document he had forced my parents to sign. He lunged forward and violently shoved the forged paper directly into Nia's face. "You are both lying," he screamed, his voice cracking with hysterical panic. "I am the legal representative of the owners. I have the power of attorney right here. It is signed by Marcus and Bernadette Adams. It is officially notarized. It gives me complete and total authority to liquidate this property immediately. You cannot stop this sale. I am in charge." I stepped forward fluidly. My phone was already in my hand, unlocked and ready. I raised the device and tapped the screen. The camera shutter clicked loudly, echoing through the tense silence of the living room. I captured a high-resolution image of Chad desperately clutching the fraudulent document. The photograph clearly showed his hands holding the paper, the forged signatures at the bottom, and the fake notary stamp he had illegally procured. I lowered my phone and looked him dead in the eye. "Thanks for handing me the felony evidence, Chad." The camera flash echoed in the silent room. Chad froze. He looked from the forged document in his trembling hand to my phone screen. The color completely drained from his face as the realization hit him. He had just voluntarily provided a forensic accountant with photographic proof of his intent to commit fraud. He lunged forward, reaching wildly for my device. "Give me that, you psychotic woman," he bellowed. Nia stepped smoothly between us. She did not raise her voice, but her presence was a brick wall. "I would strongly advise against touching my client," she said, her tone razor sharp. "Unless you want me to call the police right now and add physical assault to your growing list of legal problems." Chad stopped dead in his tracks, breathing heavily. Sister Margaret stood up from the velvet sofa. She adjusted her fascinator with shaking hands. "Well, I think it is time we took our leave, ladies," she announced. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the shattered teacup, the spilled tea, and my sweating brother-in-law. The other 5 women scrambled to their feet, grabbing their designer purses with frantic energy. Bernadette snapped out of her paralyzed state, the threat of public ruin finally overriding her shock. She rushed toward the women blocking the foyer. "Ladies, please," Bernadette begged, her voice thick with desperation. "This is just a terrible misunderstanding. Maya has always been prone to these dramatic outbursts. It is a private family matter. We will resume our charity planning next week." Sister Margaret offered a thin, unsympathetic smile. "I highly doubt that, Bernadette. We will pray for your family." The women marched out the front door in a single file line. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind them, sealing us inside. Nia looked at me and offered a professional nod. "I will wait in the car, Maya. Take all the time you need. Let me know when the premises are secure for the interior appraisal." She walked out, leaving me alone with the wreckage of my family. The second the door closed, Bernadette spun around. The fake Southern hospitality vanished entirely, replaced by a vicious, desperate rage. She did not yell at Chloe for throwing boiling tea at my face. She did not reprimand Chad for forging legal documents. She turned all her fury directly onto me. "We had to do this!" Bernadette screamed, her hands balling into fists. She marched across the ruined Persian rug. "We are drowning in debt and Chad promised to save us. Why are you so selfish, Maya? Why do you always have to ruin everything for us?" I stared at the woman who gave birth to me. "You are calling me selfish?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "I paid off a federal tax lien to save this house from foreclosure. I let you live here rent-free for 4 years. And your response is to try and illegally sell my property behind my back. You hid your money from us!" Chloe screeched from the arm of the sofa. "You let us struggle while you were secretly buying real estate and hoarding wealth. You knew Chad was having a hard time launching his investment firm, and you did absolutely nothing to help your own family. A real sister would have offered the capital. Your father is losing his standing at the country club." Bernadette sobbed dramatically, clutching her chest. "The manufacturing business is failing. We are bleeding money just trying to maintain our image in this community. We cannot afford to look poor, Maya." Chad had a brilliant plan. He was going to use the equity from this house to fund a bridge loan. He was going to double our money and save your father's business. He was doing what a man is supposed to do. You just do not understand loyalty. I refused to yield to her tears. I refused to let her play the victim. "You are not selling this house to pay off debt." "Mother," I said, my voice slicing through her theatrical sobbing, "you are selling it to keep Chad out of federal prison." Chad flinched. He took another step backward, bumping into the antique console table. "Shut up, Maya," he stammered. "Do not listen to her, Bernadette. She is trying to turn you against me. She is crazy." I pulled up the exact financial tracking models I had built over the last 48 hours. "Chad does not have a brilliant plan, Mother. He has a massive gambling addiction. He has been systematically siphoning money out of his clients' escrow accounts for the past 8 months. He lost $250,000 betting on offshore sports syndicates. He thought he could win it back by borrowing against margin accounts, but he lost that too." I stepped closer to my mother, forcing her to look at the screen. "He is short $250,000. The federal regulators are already circling his firm. He knew an audit was coming. He needed a massive injection of cash immediately to replace the stolen client funds before the auditors found the missing money." "That is a lie!" Chloe screamed, covering her ears. "He is a provider. He went to Wharton. He is a criminal." "Chloe," I fired back. "He realized my parents had a fully paid off house. He convinced them to sign a power of attorney by promising to double their money. He planned to sell my house, take the cash, replace his stolen funds, and leave Marcus and Bernadette completely homeless. He was going to let his own in-laws take the fall for his massive financial crimes." The silence in the room was absolute. Bernadette looked at Chad. For the first time, the blind adoration in her eyes was replaced by genuine terror. Chad shook his head furiously, but he had no words left. His tailored suit looked ridiculous on his shrinking frame. He was a cornered animal, realizing all the exits were permanently sealed. Suddenly, a sharp, loud ringing pierced the quiet room. It was coming from Chad's pocket. His cell phone. He jumped as if he had been physically struck. He pulled the phone from his pocket with a trembling hand. He looked down at the bright screen. I watched the last drop of blood drain from his face. His skin turned a sickly shade of gray. His eyes widened in absolute horror. His fingers went completely slack. The heavy crystal glass of bourbon slipped from his grip. It hit the hardwood floor and shattered into dozens of jagged pieces, sending amber liquid splashing across his expensive leather shoes. I looked at him and allowed a slow, satisfied smile to spread across my face. "Is that the SEC calling, Chad? I sent them an email this morning." The relentless ringing of the cell phone echoed in the silent room like a fire alarm. Chad stared at the glowing screen in his trembling hand. He did not answer. He could not answer. His thumb hovered over the glowing green button, but his entire body was paralyzed by absolute terror. The ringing finally stopped, replaced by the sharp, cold chime of a voicemail notification. The sound seemed to snap him out of his trance. His breathing became jagged and shallow. He looked around the ruined living room, his eyes darting frantically from the shattered crystal at his feet to the damp walls and finally to his wife. He reached out and grabbed Chloe by the forearm. His grip was entirely too tight. Chloe let out a sharp gasp as his fingers dug into her skin. "We need to talk," Chad hissed, his voice reduced to a desperate, frantic whisper. "Right now." He yanked her forward. Chloe stumbled in her designer heels, struggling to keep her balance as Chad practically dragged her across the Persian rug. He pulled her toward the heavy swinging doors of the kitchen, pushing through them with brutal force. The doors swung shut behind them, cutting off the sound of their panicked, overlapping voices. I remained standing in the center of the living room, holding my iPad. The silence they left behind was suffocating. I turned my attention to my parents. Bernadette was still slumped on the velvet sofa, staring blankly at the puddle of bourbon soaking into the floorboards. Her carefully constructed reality had been completely obliterated in less than 10 minutes. Marcus, however, was already trying to rebuild his shattered authority. He smoothed the front of his cashmere cardigan and squared his shoulders. The fear in his eyes was quickly being masked by a rising tide of indignant anger. He took a step toward me, carefully avoiding the broken glass. "You have to fix this," Maya, Marcus demanded, his voice hard and entirely devoid of any warmth. "You have to call them back. You have to retract that email right now. Tell them you made a mistake. Tell them your accounts were hacked. I do not care what lie you have to invent, but you are going to fix this mess." I let out a harsh, humorless laugh. "Fix this," I echoed, staring at the man who had spent my entire life treating me like a disposable asset. "You want me to commit federal perjury and obstruct a Securities and Exchange Commission investigation to protect a man who just tried to steal your home." "Hi, is your sister's husband," Marcus bellowed, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "He is family. You do not do this to family. I do not care what kind of financial trouble he is in. Men make mistakes in business, Maya. They over-leverage. They take risks. That is how wealth is built. You come in here with your self-righteous attitude, acting like you are completely flawless. If Chad goes down, Chloe loses everything. Her house, her cars, her reputation. She will have absolutely nothing left. She will be ruined in this community." Bernadette suddenly found her voice. Her hands were shaking as she clutched her pearl necklace. "We will be pariahs, Maya," she whimpered, tears spilling over her eyelashes and ruining her expensive mascara. The church board members just watched this entire disaster. By tomorrow morning, everyone at the country club will know. Everyone in our social circle will be whispering about us. You have the money, Maya. You run a massive firm. You can cover his shortfall. You can pay back whatever he borrowed from his clients before the federal auditors arrive. You did it for your father with the IRS. You have to do it for your sister. You cannot just let her husband go to federal prison." I looked at my mother, feeling nothing but absolute disgust. "You are begging me to empty my accounts to save a thief just so you can show your face at Sunday service." "Bernadette," I said, my tone dropping to a freezing calm, "you would rather enable a criminal than face the truth. But you are both missing the most important part of this entire tragedy. You are standing here demanding that I save Chloe from losing everything." I tapped the screen of my iPad, swiping past the offshore betting ledgers and pulling up a new set of highly encrypted banking documents. "Chloe already lost everything." Marcus frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, crossing his arms over his chest. "Chad is the one facing the margin calls. Chloe's personal assets are completely separate. I made sure of it." "Did you, Marcus?" I challenged, taking a step forward and holding the glowing screen up to his face. "Because I am looking at the exact routing numbers for the private individual savings accounts you and Bernadette helped Chloe set up before the wedding. The secret nest egg you funded, so she would always have her own financial security. The accounts she swore she would never give Chad access to." Bernadette's breath hitched. She pushed herself up from the sofa, her eyes locked onto the screen. I swiped down, revealing a devastating chronological list of massive wire transfers. "Chad did not just steal from his clients," I explained mercilessly. "He has been systematically draining Chloe's secret savings accounts for the past 6 months. He forged her digital signature on 3 separate authorization forms." "Look at the screen, Marcus." $50,000 transferred in November, $75,000 transferred in January. Every single cent was funneled directly into the same offshore sports betting syndicate he used to hide his client funds. He bled your golden child completely dry. Her account balance is exactly zero. Marcus stared at the negative balances flashing in bright red font. His mouth hung open. The arrogant patriarch persona was finally completely shattered. He reached out with a trembling hand as if trying to touch the numbers on the glass screen. Bernadette let out a sharp, devastated wail and collapsed back onto the sofa. The reality of Chad's parasitic nature was undeniable. He had not just ruined himself, he had financially gutted their favorite daughter. Before Marcus could even formulate a response, the heavy kitchen doors burst open violently, crashing against the walls. Chloe marched out into the living room. Her face was heavily flushed, and her expensive silk robe was slightly askew. Her makeup was streaked with fresh tears, but her eyes were burning with a completely unhinged, furious energy. She had been listening through the crack in the door. She had heard every single word of my revelation. She had seen the iPad in my hand. The logical reaction would have been absolute devastation. The rational response would have been to turn her fury toward the man hiding in the kitchen who had just stolen her entire life savings. But Chloe was the golden child. She had been conditioned her entire life to view me as the enemy. Her toxic pride could not handle the humiliation of admitting she had married a complete fraud. She stormed across the room, ignoring our parents and marching directly up to me. She pointed a trembling manicured finger inches from my face. "You hacked his accounts!" Chloe screamed, her voice shrill and echoing off the ceiling. "You are invading our privacy. You had absolutely no right to dig into our personal finances, Maya." I stared at her in utter disbelief. "He stole your money, Chloe," I said slowly, emphasizing every single syllable. "He forged your signature and gambled away every dime Dad gave you." "You are twisting the truth just to destroy my marriage!" Chloe shrieked violently, swatting her hand through the air, as if trying to physically bat away my words. "You have always been jealous of me. Chad did not steal anything. He is a brilliant investor. We discussed those transfers. He only took that money to invest it for our baby." Chloe placed both of her hands over her perfectly flat stomach and began to rub it in a slow, protective circle. She lifted her chin, staring at me with a desperate, delusional defiance. She was weaponizing the one thing she knew would instantly manipulate our parents: a fabricated pregnancy to shield a felon. Bernadette let out a sharp, breathless gasp that echoed loudly in the tense living room. She shoved past Marcus, completely ignoring the scattered shards of crystal and the puddle of spilled bourbon soaking into the expensive rug. She practically threw herself across the room to reach Chloe. She wrapped her arms tightly around her youngest daughter, pulling her into a fiercely protective embrace. Her demeanor shifted instantly from a woman devastated by financial ruin to a ferocious mother bear defending her fragile cub. She began stroking Chloe's perfectly styled hair while glaring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. "A baby!" Bernadette cried out, her voice trembling with a sickening mixture of joy and vicious anger. "My beautiful girl is bringing a new life into this world." She turned her tear-stained face entirely toward me and unleashed decades of pent-up resentment. "Look at what you are doing, Maya. You are stressing her out. You are deliberately attacking a vulnerable pregnant woman in her own home. You are going to make your sister miscarry. You are a monster." Bernadette tightened her grip on Chloe, shielding her, as if my mere presence in the room was a physical threat. "You have always been completely unnatural, Maya." She spat, her words laced with absolute venom. "You care more about spreadsheets and bank accounts than you do about human life. You are just jealous. You are bitter and alone, and you cannot stand the fact that your sister is building a beautiful traditional family while you sit in an empty office. You want to destroy her happiness because you are miserable. You are trying to send the father of your unborn niece or nephew to federal prison over a simple misunderstanding." Chloe leaned her head against our mother's shoulder, playing the role of the exhausted, persecuted victim to absolute perfection. She let out a soft, pathetic sniffle and subtly wiped a fake tear from her cheek. She peered at me from behind Bernadette's shoulder, and for a fraction of a second, a smug, victorious smirk flashed across her face. She honestly believed she had won. She believed she had played the ultimate trump card that would force me to back down and apologize. She thought the illusion of a baby would instantly erase $250,000 in felony wire fraud. I did not flinch. I did not blink. I stood perfectly still and let the heavy, suffocating silence stretch across the room until Bernadette's dramatic echoing sobs began to sound utterly ridiculous. I looked directly at Chloe. I watched her hand resting protectively over her flat stomach. "A baby, Chloe?" I asked, my voice dropping to a freezing clinical whisper that cut through the hysteria like a scalpel. "Are we really doing this right now? Are we adding biological miracles to the list of things Chad is supposedly providing for this family?" Chloe lifted her chin, her eyes flashing with a desperate, panicked defiance. "How dare you?" she snapped, her voice shrill. "I am 2 months along." Chad and I were waiting for the perfect moment to tell everyone. I slowly shook my head, feeling a profound sense of exhaustion mixed with absolute clarity. I unlocked my iPad and tapped on a secure encrypted folder titled Personal Expenses. I did not need to search for the document. I knew exactly where it was. "You are not pregnant, Chloe," I stated, presenting it as an undeniable biological fact. "You told me you had your tubes tied 3 years ago, and I have the hospital bill I paid for you to prove it." The entire room froze as if someone had hit a pause button on reality. Chloe stopped breathing. Her hand dropped away from her stomach as if she had just touched a burning stove. The smug, victorious smirk was completely wiped from her face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking like a pale, hollow ghost. I took a deliberate step forward, turning the bright screen of my iPad toward my parents. "You came to my downtown office on a rainy Tuesday morning 3 years ago, Chloe." I continued, my voice completely void of emotion. "You were hysterically crying. You told me Chad was demanding a child to complete his perfect corporate family image, but you absolutely refused to ruin your body. You were terrified that Mom and Dad would disown you for refusing to give them grandchildren. You begged me to pay the out-of-pocket costs for a private, discreet surgical clinic in upstate New York, so the procedure would never show up on your joint health insurance statements. I wired $12,000 directly to the surgeon that same afternoon. I have the medical receipts, the wire transfer confirmations, and the frantic text messages you sent thanking me for keeping your secret." Bernadette physically recoiled. She stumbled backward, bumping hard into the antique tea cart. The porcelain plates rattled loudly against the wood. She looked at Chloe with an expression of absolute horror. "In our highly conservative, image-obsessed family, a secret voluntary sterilization was a massive, unforgivable scandal. It shattered the illusion of the perfect traditional daughter Bernadette had bragged about to her church circle for years." Chloe Marcus roared, his voice shaking the crystal chandelier above us. "Is this true? Did you lie to your own mother about carrying a child?" Chloe opened her mouth, but she was completely paralyzed. She looked at her furious father and her devastated mother. She had built her entire life on a foundation of pretty lies, and I had just detonated the very last one. She had absolutely nowhere left to hide. Chad did not look shocked by the medical revelation. He did not look like a heartbroken husband who had just discovered he was never going to be a father. He looked like a cornered rat who realized his human shield had just evaporated into thin air. The fake pregnancy was supposed to manipulate my parents into forcing me to drop the investigation. Now that the lie was exposed, he knew the emotional leverage was completely gone. He knew the Securities and Exchange Commission was actively reviewing his files. He knew he was out of time. Chad abruptly abandoned the grieving husband routine. He stepped away from Chloe, entirely treating her like a discarded prop. He reached a trembling hand inside the breast pocket of his ruined custom suit jacket. He pulled out a sleek, leather-bound checkbook. His hands were shaking so violently he nearly dropped it onto the floor. He scrambled to pull a silver pen from his shirt pocket, his breathing ragged and desperate. He had completely abandoned any pretense of innocence. "Fine," Chad spat, his voice cracking with panicked, transactional desperation. "You want a cut? Is that what this is about, Maya? You want your piece of the pie?" He clicked the pen frantically. "I will write you a check right now. I will give you $50,000 right now to walk away and withdraw the SEC complaint." I looked down at the leather checkbook in his trembling hands. The silver pen slipped against the paper as a bead of sweat dripped from his chin and landed right on the signature line. He was panting heavily, his chest heaving under his ruined designer suit. He actually thought $50,000 was going to be the magic number. He honestly believed he could buy his way out of federal prison right here in the middle of my living room. I did not move to take the check. I did not even reach for the pen he was frantically offering me. I just stared at the account routing number printed at the bottom of the crisp white slip of paper. A slow, humorless smile spread across my face. You are writing me a check from an account that has a negative balance of $12,000. Chad, I said, my voice slicing through his frantic panting. I am a forensic accountant. I track money for a living. I know exactly where every single cent of yours is hiding, and more importantly, I know exactly what you owe. You are broke. Chad froze. The pen hovered a millimeter above the paper. I stepped closer, forcing him to look me in the eye. That specific checking account is held at First National. I continued reciting the details with absolute mechanical precision. You overdrew it last Tuesday trying to cover a margin call from a broker in Chicago. Your backup credit line was frozen by the bank on Thursday. Your corporate accounts have been flagged for suspicious activity, and your personal savings account was zeroed out yesterday afternoon. You do not have $50,000, Chad. You do not have $50. If I tried to cash that check, it would bounce before I even walked out of the bank lobby, and you would be adding bank fraud to your rapidly growing list of federal offenses. The silver pen slipped from his slick fingers and hit the hardwood floor with a sharp metallic clatter. The sound echoed in the dead silence of the room. Chad stared at me, his jaw slack, his eyes wide with the realization that he was completely exposed. The illusion of the wealthy, successful investment banker was entirely gone. He was nothing but a desperate, broke criminal standing in a puddle of spilled bourbon. Chloe let out a low, agonizing wail. She slumped off the arm of the sofa and sank to her knees on the ruined Persian rug. The fake pregnancy, the stolen money, the impending federal charges. It all finally crashed down on her at once. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently, as her entire perfectly curated world burned to ash around her. Marcus stared at Chad. The color had completely drained from my father's face. For the first time in his life, the arrogant manufacturing executive was entirely speechless. He looked from the sobbing mess of his favorite daughter to the trembling shell of his son-in-law. The reality of the situation was finally penetrating his thick skull. There was no secret wealth. There was no brilliant investment strategy. There was no rescue coming for his failing business or his precious country club reputation. Chad was a black hole, and he was going to drag all of them down into the dark with him. But Marcus was not a man who accepted defeat. He was a man who demanded control at all costs. If Chad could not save him, then he had to save himself. His eyes darted around the room, calculating his remaining assets. His gaze landed on the antique furniture, the crystal chandelier, the expensive artwork hanging on the walls. He was doing the math in his head. He needed cash immediately to save his business and maintain his social standing. The house was the only valuable thing left in the equation. He spun around to face me. The shock in his eyes was instantly replaced by a cold, calculating fury. The facade of the loving father vanished completely, revealing the ruthless businessman underneath. He took a heavy step toward me, his fists clenched at his sides. Bernadette sensed the shift in his demeanor. She scrambled up from the sofa, her pearl necklace rattling against her chest. She moved to stand right beside Marcus, mirroring his hostile posture. Together they formed a solid, aggressive wall. "If Chad is ruined, then we are selling this house today," Marcus barked, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I do not care about your little financial spreadsheets, Maya. I do not care about the SEC. I am the patriarch of this family, and I am telling you that we are liquidating this property. We will put it on the market by tomorrow morning. We can use the equity to cover Chloe's losses and keep my manufacturing firm afloat until this scandal blows over." "You are not selling anything," I said, calmly clutching my iPad to my chest. "I told you both earlier that you cannot use this property to bail out a criminal, and you certainly cannot use it to fund your country club membership while your daughter is married to a felon." Marcus let out a loud, furious roar. He lunged forward, closing the distance between us in two long strides. Bernadette moved with him, grabbing my arm with her sharp manicured fingernails. They pushed me backward, forcing me toward the grand foyer. They positioned themselves directly in front of the heavy oak front door, physically blocking my exit. "You are not leaving this house." Maya Marcus threatened, his face inches from mine. His breath smelled of stale coffee and absolute desperation. "You are going to march into that study right now, and you are going to call your lawyers. You are going to sign a waiver dropping your claim to this house." Bernadette tightened her grip on my arm, her eyes wild and frantic. "You owe us!" she hissed, her voice shrill and vibrating with panic. "We gave you life, we raised you, we clothed you. You are going to sign the waiver, Maya. You will not ruin this family. You are not leaving until you sign a waiver dropping your claim to this house." I looked at the two people who had brought me into this world. I looked at their red faces, their bared teeth, their absolute willingness to physically intimidate their own daughter just to protect their fragile social status and their bank accounts. They were perfectly willing to hold me hostage over bricks and mortar. They still believed they had the upper hand. They still believed they held the power in this dynamic. I did not scream. I did not try to physically fight them off. I simply looked down at Bernadette's hand clutching my arm and let out a soft, disappointed sigh. I gently but firmly pried her fingers off my sleeve, brushing my jacket off as if she had left dirt on the fabric. I easily stepped around them. My heels clicked with absolute authority against the marble floor of the foyer as I moved toward the door. I reached out and wrapped my hand around the cool brass handle. I looked back over my shoulder at my furious parents and offered them a chillingly serene smile. "I do not need to make a claim," I said, my voice echoing perfectly in the grand entryway. "You need to check the county deed records from 2022. I walked out into the crisp afternoon air, letting the heavy oak door slam shut behind me. The satisfying thud echoed across the manicured front lawn, separating me from the absolute chaos unfolding inside the living room. Nia was already waiting by my sleek black sedan, her posture perfectly straight, and her eyes scanning the perimeter like a Secret Service agent. She opened the passenger door for me without saying a single word. The shockwave I had just unleashed inside that house was palpable. I had given them the ultimate puzzle piece to solve. The county deed records from 2022 would reveal the absolute truth they had been too arrogant and too self-absorbed to ever investigate. When I paid off the massive federal tax lien to save them from foreclosure 2 years ago, I did not just hand over the cash out of the goodness of my heart. I had legally assumed full ownership of the property. They had been living in my house as my tenants for 2 years, and Chad was trying to sell an asset that legally belonged exclusively to me. Before I could slide into the cool leather seat of the car, the front door burst open again. Chloe stumbled out onto the porch. She had kicked off her designer heels and was running barefoot across the rough concrete driveway. Her expensive silk robe fluttered wildly behind her. She looked utterly frantic. "Maya, wait!" she screamed, her voice cracking with raw desperation. "Maya, please do not get in the car!" I paused, keeping one hand resting on the car door. I watched my sister sprint across the driveway. The perfectly curated country club princess facade was completely gone. She looked entirely unhinged. Her chest was heaving as she reached the sedan, slamming her hands onto the roof of the car to catch her breath. She did not try to slap me. She did not yell about the fake pregnancy or scream about the zeroed-out bank accounts. She instantly shifted her entire strategy. Chloe dropped to her knees right there on the cold concrete driveway. She grabbed the fabric of my tailored coat, pulling at me with trembling hands. Tears began pouring down her face in thick, heavy streams. "Please, Maya," she sobbed, her voice dropping an octave into a guttural, panicked whisper. "You do not understand what is happening. You do not know who Chad has been dealing with. It is not just the Securities and Exchange Commission. It is not just federal auditors looking into his firm. He borrowed money from dangerous people to try and cover the margin calls. He went to illegal offshore lenders when the banks completely cut him off." I stared down at her, watching the desperation warp her features. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach, not out of fear, but out of absolute disgust. "Are you telling me your Wharton-educated husband is in debt to violent loan sharks, Chloe?" "Chloe," I asked, my voice dangerously level. "They are going to hurt us." "Maya," she wept, clutching my coat tighter and pulling herself closer to my legs. "They called his cell phone this morning. They know exactly where we live. They know where Mom and Dad live. Chad owes them $250,000 by the end of the week. If we do not sell this house and get the cash wired to them by Friday, they are going to come after us. They threatened to break his legs, Maya. They threatened to come after me. You have to let the sale go through. You have to let us use the equity from the house. If you do not let Chad close this deal, they are going to kill him. Please, Maya. You are my big sister. You are supposed to protect me. She buried her face against my leg, weeping hysterically. It was the ultimate emotional manipulation. She was playing on the deeply ingrained childhood dynamic, where I was always expected to shield her from the consequences of her own terrible actions. She wanted me to feel responsible for her physical safety. She wanted me to empty my pockets and sacrifice my own property to save her from the monsters her husband had invited into their lives. But her confession revealed something much darker. "You knew," I said, my voice slicing through the crisp air. "You knew he owed dangerous people money. You knew he was in trouble, and your solution was to let him sell Mom and Dad's house and leave them completely homeless just to save your own skin. You were perfectly fine throwing our parents to the wolves as long as you got to keep playing the wealthy socialite." Chloe choked on a sob, refusing to look up at me. "Please, Maya," she begged again. "Just let the deal happen." I looked down at the woman shivering at my feet. For 27 years, I had been the designated shock absorber for this family. I had taken the blame for her mistakes. I had bailed out my parents' financial blunders. I had absorbed their insults, their condescension, and their cruelty, while silently paying the bills that kept a roof over their heads. I had played the role of the reliable scapegoat to absolute perfection. But looking at Chloe now shivering on the concrete and begging me to sacrifice my own assets to save her fraudulent parasitic husband, I felt absolutely nothing. The well of sisterly obligation was completely bone dry. I reached down and grabbed her wrists. I pried her fingers off my coat with cold, calculated precision. I took a deliberate step backward, forcing her to look up at me. "Your husband's gambling and embezzlement debts are not my black tax to pay," I said, my voice ringing out with absolute finality. "I am not your safety net, Chloe. I am not your emergency fund. I am not the invisible bank account you get to drain whenever your perfect life starts to crack." Chad made his choices. He stole from his clients. He stole from you. He borrowed money from violent criminals. Those are his consequences to face. "But they will hurt me," she whimpered, trying to reach for my hand again. "Then you should pack a bag and call the police," I replied, stepping further out of her reach. "Or better yet, ask Mom and Dad to sell their country club memberships and Chad's luxury cars to raise the cash. But you are not touching my property. I am done carrying this family. I am done paying for your mistakes. I am done being the villain until you suddenly need a savior." The transformation was instantaneous. The second Chloe realized the tears were not going to work, the hysterical sobbing stopped entirely. The panicked trembling vanished as if someone had flipped a switch. She slowly stood up from the driveway, brushing the dirt off her bare knees with terrifying composure. The frightened little sister routine evaporated, completely replaced by a look of pure, concentrated malice. Her eyes narrowed into dark, furious slits. She looked exactly like Bernadette in that moment, vicious, entitled, and utterly ruthless. "You think you are so smart, Maya." Chloe sneered, her voice dropping the frantic edge and becoming as sharp as broken glass. "You think you hold all the cards just because you paid off a tax lien 2 years ago. But you are wrong. We have the power of attorney. Mom and Dad signed it over to Chad yesterday morning, and it is fully notarized and legally binding." She crossed her arms over her chest, lifting her chin with a smug, defiant glare. "We are signing the closing papers with the buyer at the notary office tomorrow at noon. The title company has already cleared the transaction. The escrow account is waiting for the funds. We are selling this house, Maya, and you cannot stop us." I slid into the plush leather seat of my sedan and closed the door, cutting off the sound of Chloe's frantic breathing and her arrogant threats. Nia put the car in drive and smoothly accelerated down the sweeping driveway, leaving my sister standing barefoot on the cold concrete. I leaned back against the headrest, watching the manicured lawns of my childhood neighborhood blur past the tinted windows. They honestly believed a forged power of attorney was their golden ticket out of ruin. You cannot sell a house you do not own, and you certainly cannot use a legal document signed by tenants to transfer a deed held by the actual landlord. The sheer audacity of their ignorance was staggering. They were walking blindly into a concrete wall, and they thought they were marching toward a finish line. 30 minutes later, Nia pulled into the secure underground garage of my downtown high-rise. I thanked her and took the private elevator directly to my penthouse. The absolute silence of my apartment was a stark, beautiful contrast to the hysterical screaming I had just escaped. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city skyline bathed in the fading afternoon light, but I ignored the sunset. I had work to do. I walked into my home office, dropped my keys onto the console, and powered on my desktop monitors. I unlocked the heavy fireproof steel filing cabinet in the corner of the room and pulled out a stack of pristine physical documents. Digital trails were essential for forensic accounting, but there was a specific, undeniable power to physical paper when dealing with arrogant people. I arranged 3 distinct red folders in a perfectly straight line across my expansive glass desk. I opened the first red folder. Inside rested the original certified county deed records from 2022. The heavy embossed paper clearly stated my name, Maya Wilson, as the sole legal owner of the Maple Street property. Marcus and Bernadette had signed a quiet quitclaim deed to avoid a highly public foreclosure, and I had graciously allowed them to remain in the house under a private tenancy agreement. Their signatures were at the bottom of the residential contract, right next to mine. A power of attorney, granting Chad the right to act on their behalf, meant absolutely nothing, because my parents possessed zero equity to transfer. They were trying to sell my house. I moved to the second red folder. This one contained the financial execution. I slid in the printed routing numbers, the offshore syndicate ledgers, and the wire transfer logs, proving Chad had systematically drained Chloe's secret nest egg. I also included the invoices from the private surgical clinic, proving Chloe had voluntarily sterilized herself 3 years ago. Every lie, every stolen dollar, every piece of fabricated emotional manipulation was documented in black and white. It was a complete chronological timeline of Chad's parasitic theft and Chloe's pathological deceit. Finally, I opened the third red folder. It contained a single crisp document drafted by my real estate attorney just a few hours ago, a formal legally binding 30-day notice of eviction. Marcus and Bernadette had violated the terms of their lease by attempting to illegally sell the property and by engaging in fraudulent activity on the premises. They had 30 days to vacate the house or face forced removal by the county sheriff's department. The safety net I had provided them for years was officially being cut. I was just closing the third folder when my secure business line began to ring. The caller ID displayed an unknown local number. I pressed the speaker button and leaned back in my leather chair. "Hello," I answered, my voice carefully neutral. "Is this Maya Wilson?" a gruff, impatient voice demanded through the speaker. "I am calling on behalf of Apex Holdings, LLC. We are scheduled to close on the Maple Street property tomorrow at noon with your brother-in-law Chad. There seems to be a minor holdup with the title company regarding some older tax liens on the estate. Chad said you were the one who originally cleared them, and he told me to call you directly to verify the payoff codes." My fingers flew across my keyboard. Apex Holdings, LLC. I ran the name through my advanced forensic databases, bypassing the surface-level corporate registries and digging straight into the underlying beneficial ownership logs. The results popped up on my screen in a matter of seconds. Apex Holdings was registered to a proxy agent in Delaware, but the primary funding source was an offshore shell account routed through the Cayman Islands. It was the exact same offshore account Chad had been funneling his stolen client funds into. I tapped the silent recording button on my phone system. "I can certainly help you with those payoff codes," I said smoothly, keeping my tone perfectly helpful. "But I just want to verify I am releasing sensitive financial data to the correct party. You are purchasing the property outright to cover Chad's current liabilities." The man on the other end let out a harsh, arrogant laugh, clearly unaware he was speaking to a forensic accountant who tracked organized money laundering for a living. "Purchasing is a strong word," he scoffed. Chad is transferring the deed to our LLC to wash the 250 grand he owes my boss. Once the house is in our name, we pull a hard money loan against the equity, wipe his slate clean, and flip the property to a real buyer. It is a quick wash. Chad gets to keep his kneecaps and my boss gets his cash with interest. Just give me the codes, lady, so we can get this notarized tomorrow. I had just voluntarily handed me a recorded confession of intent to commit real estate fraud, money laundering, and extortion. I typed the reference numbers into my database, smiling at the glowing screen. The codes you need are 004 and 809. I lied, giving him dummy internal reference numbers that would keep the title company busy searching dead ends for the next 24 hours. Perfect, the man grunted. See you tomorrow. He hung up abruptly. I sat in the quiet office listening to the recording play back through my speakers. Chad was not just trying to steal a house to pay off a bad bet. He was actively attempting to use a property he did not own to launder money for an organized crime syndicate. He was dragging my entire family directly into a federal racketeering investigation. I picked up my personal cell phone and opened my text messages. I navigated to my conversation with Chloe. She had not sent me anything since I drove away from the house. She was likely too busy celebrating her perceived victory, convincing herself that her counterfeit power of attorney had checkmated me. She probably thought I was sitting in my apartment crying over my defeat. I tapped the screen, my thumbs moving with precise, deliberate speed. I will see you at the notary tomorrow at noon, I typed. Make sure you wear something nice. I hit send and watched the message turn green. Less than a minute later, the three gray typing bubbles appeared. Chloe's response popped onto the screen, dripping with arrogant relief. I am glad you finally understand your place, Maya. Do not be late. The downtown notary office was a masterpiece of corporate intimidation. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls offered a dizzying panoramic view of the city skyline, while polished mahogany floors absorbed the sound of frantic footsteps. I stepped off the private elevator at exactly 11:55 on Tuesday morning. I did not rush. I did not check my watch. I walked down the long corridor with the serene, absolute calm of a woman who was holding the executioner's axe. Through the soundproof glass walls of the primary conference room, I could see my family already gathered. They had arrived early, eager to secure their stolen prize. Chad was completely back in his element. The sweating, panicked rat from yesterday afternoon had been entirely replaced by the arrogant investment banker. He was wearing a fresh, custom-tailored charcoal suit, laughing loudly and clapping a thick-necked man on the shoulder. I instantly recognized the man from his voice on the phone yesterday. The Apex Holdings representative. The money launderer. He was wearing a suit that cost more than a car, but he still carried the distinct, rigid posture of a violent enforcer. Chad was desperate to impress him, practically bowing as he offered the man a bottle of sparkling water. Chloe sat next to her husband, draped in an aggressive amount of designer logos. She was wearing a Chanel tweed jacket, a Gucci silk scarf, and carrying a Birkin bag that she had placed prominently on the center of the table. She was using the luxury brands as physical armor, trying to mask the absolute terror she had displayed on my driveway yesterday. Her leg was bouncing rapidly under the glass table, betraying her desperate anxiety, but her face was locked into a mask of haughty entitlement. Marcus and Bernadette were seated at the opposite end of the long table, looking completely relaxed and victorious. They were already spending money that did not belong to them. We will take a healthy portion of the equity and immediately secure a new vacation home down in Boca Raton. Marcus declared, his booming voice carrying through the heavy glass door as I approached. The market down there is perfectly positioned for cash buyers right now. We can close by the end of the month and leave all this ridiculous northeastern stress behind us. Bernadette nodded enthusiastically, adjusting her diamond tennis bracelet. It is exactly what we deserve, Marcus. A fresh start in a beautiful community where we are surrounded by our own kind of people. We have carried the burden of this family for far too long. It is time we prioritize our own happiness and let the chips fall where they may. I placed my hand on the cool metal handle of the conference room door. They were openly discussing buying luxury real estate with the stolen proceeds of my property while sitting feet away from an organized crime associate. Their delusion was so profound, it bordered on a psychiatric condition. I pushed the heavy door open and stepped into the room. The conversation died instantly. 4 pairs of eyes snapped toward me. I was not wearing my usual rigid corporate armor. I was not dressed for a boardroom battle. I wore a stunning relaxed outfit, wide-leg cream trousers, a soft camel cashmere sweater, and comfortable leather loafers. My hair was loose and my makeup was minimal. I carried absolutely nothing except a single slim red leather briefcase. I looked like a woman who was stopping by for a casual lunch, not a woman preparing to lose a multi-million-dollar estate. Chad stopped laughing with his criminal associate. He looked me up and down, taking in my relaxed demeanor and the absence of a legal team. He instantly assumed my lack of armor meant I had surrendered. A smug, victorious smirk spread across his face, revealing all of his perfectly whitened teeth. "Glad you finally accepted your place," Maya Chad said, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. He waved his hand toward a small row of visitor chairs lined up against the far wall away from the main table. "Sit in the corner. We are just wrapping up the adult business here. You can review the leftover paperwork when we are finished." Chloe leaned back in her plush leather chair, crossing her arms over her Chanel jacket. She shot me a look of pure, unadulterated malice. The tears and the begging from my driveway were completely forgotten. She had her human shield back and she was thrilled to watch me submit. I did not walk to the corner. I walked directly to the center of the massive mahogany table right between Chad and his Apex Holdings associate. I set my single red leather briefcase down on the polished wood. The soft thud echoed in the silent room. Before Chad could open his mouth to reprimand me, the heavy double doors at the back of the conference room swung open. The notary public, an older, stern man named Mr. Sterling, entered the room. He had been practicing corporate and real estate law for over 40 years. He possessed a severe, no-nonsense demeanor and a reputation for absolute meticulous accuracy. He carried a thick stack of closing documents under his arm. "Good afternoon, everyone," Mr. Sterling said, his voice dry and clinical as he took his seat at the head of the table. He adjusted his gold wire-rimmed glasses and placed the thick stack of papers in front of him. "Let us proceed efficiently. I understand we have an expedited deed transfer and a cash closing to execute today." "Yes, sir," Chad said eagerly, leaning forward and sliding a crisp document across the table. "We have everything ready to go. The power of attorney is right on top. My in-laws, Marcus and Bernadette, have legally authorized me to execute the total sale of the Maple Street estate on their behalf. The buyer is present and the funds are sitting in escrow." Marcus puffed out his chest, projecting the image of a wealthy patriarch overseeing his empire. "Everything is in perfect order, Mr. Sterling. We are ready to sign." Mr. Sterling did not smile. He picked up the document Chad had slid across the table. The room was suffocatingly quiet. Chloe stopped bouncing her leg. Chad held his breath. The Apex associate stared blankly at the wall, waiting for his newly laundered asset to be finalized. I stood perfectly still, watching the gears of justice slowly engage. The notary took Chad's forged power of attorney. He scanned it, his thick gray eyebrows drawing together. He frowned deeply, examining the signatures at the bottom of the page, and then looked at the property address listed on the header. He slowly lowered the document onto the table. He looked at Marcus. He looked at Chad. And then he turned his head and locked his stern, piercing eyes directly on me. "Ms. Wilson, is this a joke?" I held Mr. Sterling's gaze without blinking. "I assure you, Mr. Sterling, this is not a joke on my part. I take fraudulent legal documents very seriously. I am not the one playing games today." Chad let out a sharp, aggressive scoff. He leaned across the heavy mahogany table, his face turning a dangerous shade of magenta. "Stop stalling, Maya," he barked. His voice was loud and abrasive, echoing off the glass walls of the conference room. He slapped his open palm hard against the polished wood surface, rattling the crystal water glasses sitting in the center of the table. "Sign the damn paper. I have the authority. I have the notarized signatures of the legal owners right here. You are just a bitter spectator in this transaction." Mr. Sterling did not flinch at the outburst. He possessed the calm, unshakable demeanor of a man who had spent 4 decades dealing with arrogant executives and desperate liars. He calmly picked up the fraudulent power of attorney by the very corner of the page, treating it as if it were contaminated. He slid it across the smooth surface of the table, pushing it directly back toward Chad's chest. "Sir," Mr. Sterling said, his voice dropping into a freezing clinical register. "Mr. and Mrs. Wilson cannot grant you power of attorney to sell a house they do not own." The air in the room instantly evaporated. The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. The Apex Holdings associate stopped staring at the wall and slowly turned his head to look at Chad, his thick neck shifting with menacing intent. The relaxed, victorious posture of my parents vanished completely. Bernadette physically recoiled as if the notary had just slapped her across the face. She let out a sharp, ragged gasp, clutching the collar of her designer blouse. "What do you mean?" she stammered, her voice pitching upward into a shrill panic. "That is absolutely ridiculous. We have owned that house for 30 years. We raised our children in that house. It is the family estate." Marcus slammed his fist onto the armrest of his leather chair. His face was purple with indignation. "This is completely unacceptable," he roared, glaring at Mr. Sterling. "I do not know what kind of incompetent operation you are running here, but I am Marcus Wilson. I am the CEO of a major manufacturing firm. My name is on the original deed. My name is on the property tax records. My name is on the utility bills. I authorized my son-in-law to execute this sale, and you are going to process this paperwork immediately, or I will have your notary license revoked by the end of the business day." Mr. Sterling adjusted his gold wire-rimmed glasses, completely unfazed by my father's blustering threats. "Your name is certainly on the utility bills, Mr. Wilson," he replied mildly. "However, your name has not been on the property deed for quite some time. The title search was completed early this morning per standard procedure for a cash closing. The legal owner of the estate is Maya Wilson. You have zero equity to transfer and zero legal authority to authorize a sale." Chad stared at the forged document sitting in front of him. A bead of sweat traced a slow path down his temple. His breathing became shallow and erratic. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a sickening mixture of terror and realization. He finally understood that he had walked his criminal associate directly into a trap. The Apex associate leaned forward, resting his massive forearms on the table. He did not yell. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked at Chad with dead, emotionless eyes. "You told my boss the asset was clear," he said, his voice a low, vibrating rumble. "You told us you had the paper. You brought me down here to sign off on a property you do not even own." Chad swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. "Wait," he croaked, holding up his trembling hands. "Just wait a minute. There has to be a clerical error. Maya is just an accountant. She does not have the capital to own a property like that. She is lying. She manipulated the records." Chloe leaped to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. She pointed a manicured finger directly at me, her face twisted with absolute malice. "You vindictive, jealous little witch," she screamed. "You are trying to steal our parents' house just to ruin my life. You are trying to sabotage my husband because you are miserable and alone. Mom and Dad own that house. They paid for it. They built it." I watched my sister unravel. I watched my parents sit in stunned, indignant denial. I watched Chad silently calculate his life expectancy as the Apex associate slowly stood up from his chair. The beautiful, pristine illusion they had all meticulously maintained for decades was finally shattering into a million jagged pieces. They had built their entire identities on the foundation of that house, on the prestige of that address, on the appearance of generational wealth. They had paraded around the country club, hosting lavish dinners and judging their neighbors while living a complete financial lie. They had treated me like a useless burden while I silently carried the crushing weight of their extravagant lifestyle. They had demanded respect while acting with absolute reckless entitlement. I did not raise my voice. I did not match their frantic, furious energy. I simply reached forward and unlatched the brass clasps of my red leather briefcase. The sharp clicks echoed loudly, cutting through Chloe's hysterical screaming. I opened the lid and pulled out the first thick red folder. I opened it, revealing the heavy embossed pages of the official county property records. I placed my hand flat on top of the document and slowly slid the real deed across the polished mahogany table, letting it come to a stop directly in front of my father. "You owned it until 4 years ago," I said, my voice carrying the absolute weight of undeniable truth. You owned it right up until the bank foreclosed on you because Dad took out a second mortgage to fund Chloe's failed boutique. The silence that engulfed the conference room was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that follows a catastrophic explosion. Marcus stared down at the heavy embossed deed resting on the table. His eyes frantically darted back and forth across the page, tracking the legal descriptions, the county seals, and the irrefutable dates. His jaw worked silently as he tried to process the reality that his entire life for the past 48 months had been a carefully constructed illusion. Bernadette gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles turning completely white. "That is impossible," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of terror and fierce denial. "We negotiated a settlement. We arranged a private deal with an anonymous investment group. A religious charity organization stepped in and purchased the debt so we could remain in our home. We signed the tenancy paperwork with Oak Heritage Holdings. The lawyer told us it was a philanthropic trust." "You signed the tenancy paperwork with a limited liability company," I corrected, my tone remaining freezing and clinical. I opened the second red folder in my briefcase and extracted a crisp stack of incorporation documents. I fanned them out across the table right next to the deed. "Oak Heritage Holdings is not a church charity, Bernadette. It is not a philanthropic trust operated by anonymous benefactors." I slid the final page forward, tapping my index finger directly on the highlighted signature line. "I am the sole managing member. I am the sole owner. I bought the debt from the bank at the foreclosure auction to keep you from being thrown out onto the street. You have been living in my house rent-free for 4 years." The color drained from Bernadette's face so rapidly I thought she might actually faint. She sank back into her plush leather chair, clutching her chest. The arrogant country club matriarch was completely gone, replaced by a woman who had just realized she was entirely dependent on the daughter she had spent decades treating like garbage. Marcus looked like he was having a stroke. He opened his mouth but no sound came out. The patriarch who demanded absolute obedience, the man who prided himself on his financial dominance, had just been exposed as a bankrupt tenant living on my charity. His entire identity was tied to that property, and I had just ripped it out from under him in front of an audience. Chloe looked from the deed to the incorporation documents, and then up at me. Her designer facade crumbled completely. The smug superiority she had walked in with evaporated, leaving only raw, unadulterated panic. She finally understood the magnitude of her husband's blunder. Chad was not just trying to sell a house they did not own. He was trying to steal a multi-million-dollar asset directly from the forensic accountant who had spent her entire career tracking white-collar crime. Chad stared at the documents, his eyes wide and bloodshot. The arrogant, polished investment banker persona shattered completely. The pristine white privilege, the assumption that he could simply charm or bully his way out of any consequence, dissolved into pure, frantic terror. He looked at the apex associate, who was now standing completely upright, his massive frame blocking the only exit from the conference room. The associate did not say a word. He did not have to. The implication of his silent, looming presence was perfectly clear. Chad had failed to deliver the asset and the debt was coming due. "You set me up!" Chad screamed, his voice cracking as he violently shoved his chair backward. It crashed against the floor-to-ceiling glass wall with a deafening thud. He pointed a shaking finger at me, his face contorted with a vicious, desperate rage. "You knew exactly what I was doing. You let me set up the escrow accounts. You let me draft the closing documents. You sat there and watched me bring these people into this office, just so you could humiliate me. You plotted this entire thing to destroy my life." How was losing his mind. The realization that he was trapped between a federal prison sentence and a violent crime syndicate broke his sanity. He lunged forward, planting his hands on the mahogany table and vaulting himself toward me. He completely ignored the reality of where he was and who was watching. He just wanted to physically attack the woman who had checkmated him. Before Chad could even clear the center of the table, Mr. Sterling reacted with the trained efficiency of a man who had anticipated this exact scenario. The notary did not shout or stand up. He simply reached under the heavy lip of the conference table and pressed the silent security panic button wired directly to the building's private security force and the local police precinct. "Sit down," Mr. Sterling commanded, his voice slicing through Chad's hysterical screaming with absolute authority. You are currently in a secure legal facility, and law enforcement has already been dispatched. If you take one more step toward Ms. Wilson, you will be leaving this building in handcuffs. Chad froze awkwardly, sprawled across the polished wood. He looked at the stern older man and then back at me. He was panting heavily, his chest heaving under his expensive suit jacket. He slowly slid back into his chair, his hands gripping his hair as he stared at the forged power of attorney still resting in the center of the table. "You framed me," Chad sobbed, his voice dropping into a pathetic whimper. "You tricked me into bringing this paperwork here. You are trying to send me to prison. You set me up, Maya." I did not blink. I did not step back. I looked down at the ruined, desperate man sitting across from me and felt absolutely zero pity. I slowly gathered my incorporation documents, placing them back into the pristine red folder. "I didn't forge the signature, Chad," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper that echoed in the silent room. "You did, and you just handed a fraudulent document to a state official." The silence that met my declaration was absolute and heavy. Chad stared at the forged document resting near Mr. Sterling's hand, as if it had suddenly transformed into a venomous snake. The reality of his situation was finally penetrating his thick skull. He had not just committed a desperate crime. He had committed a documented felony in front of a licensed state official and an organized crime associate while attempting to defraud a forensic accountant. I was completely and utterly trapped. The Apex Holdings representative did not wait for the dust to settle. He recognized a burning building when he saw one. He smoothly pushed his chair back from the table, his massive frame moving with terrifying predatory grace. He buttoned his suit jacket and looked down at Chad with a completely blank expression. "This deal is dead," the man rumbled, his voice devoid of any human warmth. "You have 24 hours to make my boss whole, Montgomery. After that, we stop calling your phone and we start visiting your house." He turned and walked out of this conference room, the heavy glass door swinging shut behind him with a definitive thud. Chloe let out a strangled, high-pitched cry, reaching for her husband's arm. Chad violently yanked his sleeve away from her grasp, his eyes darting frantically around the room looking for an exit that did not exist. The polished investment banker persona had completely evaporated, leaving behind a sweating, terrified coward. It was Bernadette who broke first. The aristocratic illusion she had worn like a second skin for her entire life completely dissolved in an instant. She looked at the red folder on the table. She looked at the fake deed. She looked at the luxury diamond watch on her wrist and suddenly realized she could no longer afford to keep it. The fantasy of a Boca Raton retirement vanished, replaced by the looming specter of absolute poverty. Her knees simply gave out. She did not merely stumble. She collapsed onto the polished mahogany floor, her designer skirt crumpling awkwardly around her legs. The sound of her knees hitting the hardwood echoed sharply in the quiet room. "Maya, please," Bernadette wailed. Real desperate tears streamed down her perfectly contoured face, ruining her expensive makeup and leaving dark streaks down her cheeks. She crawled forward on the hardwood floor, reaching her shaking hands out toward my leather loafers. The matriarch of the family, the woman who had spent 3 decades looking down her nose at me, was now groveling at my feet. "Maya, please, we are your blood. You cannot do this to us. Just sell the house and give Chad the money. We will be ruined." The sheer magnificent audacity of her request hung in the cold air of the conference room. She was on her knees facing absolute financial annihilation and a criminal investigation, and her immediate instinct was still to demand that I sacrifice my own hard-earned assets to save her golden child's husband. She was literally begging me to liquidate the property I had rescued from their own incompetence just to pay off a money launderer and keep her pathetic country club fantasy alive. Marcus stood frozen near his chair, unable to even look at his wife crying on the floor. His massive ego had been entirely hollowed out in a matter of minutes. He was a king without a kingdom, a patriarch who had just been exposed as a complete financial fraud. He had nothing left to leverage. He could not bully me. He could not threaten me. His blustering corporate dominance was useless here. He could only watch in impotent silence as his wife begged the daughter they had routinely discarded. I did not step back. I did not offer my hand to help her up. I stood perfectly tall, looking down at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel completely invisible. I felt no sudden surge of pity. I felt no lingering familial guilt. I felt only the clean, sharp edge of absolute clarity. You excluded me from Christmas to steal from me, I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. Bernadette flinched as if I had struck her physically, but I did not stop. You sat at a holiday table eating food paid for by my charity and planned how to forge my name to liquidate my home. You allowed this man, I gestured coldly toward the trembling Chad, to disrespect me in my own driveway. You cheered while he threatened me. You celebrated what you thought was my total destruction. We made a mistake, Maya Bernadette sobbed, burying her face in her hands. We were desperate. You were greedy, I corrected her sharply, my voice ringing off the glass walls. You were arrogant. Blood does not mean you get to bleed me dry. It does not give you a free pass to commit real estate fraud. The safety net is gone, Bernadette. You are going to have to face the consequences of your own actions. Mr. Sterling sat quietly at the head of the table, calmly gathering his pristine legal documents and sliding them back into his leather portfolio. He wanted absolutely no part of the impending wreckage. Chad was hyperventilating, now his hands gripping his hair as he rocked back and forth in his leather chair. He was trapped. The Apex associate was coming for his money, and the forged deed was sitting in plain sight on a mahogany table. Suddenly, the heavy double doors at the entrance of the notary office flew open. The sound was loud enough to make Chloe shriek in terror. Heavy synchronized footsteps echoed rapidly down the polished corridor. It was not the building security team that Mr. Sterling had summoned with his panic button. The conference room doors burst open with overwhelming force. Two tall men wearing dark suits and tactical vests strode into the room. Their badges hung prominently from their belts, glinting under the recessed lighting. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from panicked desperation to absolute finality. The lead agent swept his sharp gaze across the room, instantly locating his target. He stepped forward, his hand resting casually near his hip. His voice boomed through the room with undeniable lethal authority. "Chadwick Montgomery, we have a warrant for your arrest for wire fraud and forgery." The lead agent did not wait for Chad to respond or process the reality of the situation. He stepped forward with practiced fluid motion, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. The metallic clack of cuffs unlocking echoed sharply against the glass walls of the conference room. Through those transparent walls, the entire floor of the high-end notary office was now watching the pristine illusion of the Wilson family actively disintegrate. Chad scrambled backward, his chair screeching against the polished mahogany floor, but there was nowhere to run. The second agent flanked him, moving with terrifying speed. He grabbed Chad's expensive custom-tailored shoulder and forced him face down onto the thick glass table. The impact knocked the wind out of Chad in a loud, pathetic wheeze, scattering his carefully arranged forged documents across the smooth surface. "You have the right to remain silent," the lead agent recited, his voice, a flat, monotonous drone that cut through the sterile air of the boardroom. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Chloe stared at the scene in absolute frozen horror for exactly 2 seconds before her brain finally registered that her perfect, wealthy lifestyle was being handcuffed to a table. The haughty entitlement completely vanished. She let out a guttural, unhinged shriek that rattled the crystal water glasses. "Chad," she screamed. She lunged across the space separating them, her heavy Birkin bag sliding off the table and crashing to the floor. She threw herself at the lead agent, grabbing the thick nylon fabric of his tactical vest with her manicured hands. "Let him go, you cannot do this to us. Do you know who we are? Let him go right now." She yanked furiously at the agent, trying to physically pull him off her husband, her face twisted into a mask of feral, screaming desperation. The second agent did not flinch. He dropped Chad's right arm, stepped back, and pointed a rigid finger directly at Chad's face. "Ma'am, step away from my partner immediately, or you will be placed under arrest for assaulting a federal officer and obstruction of justice." He barked, his tone carrying the absolute promise of immediate violence. "Put your hands behind your head and step back." Chloe recoiled as if she had been burned by a live wire. She stumbled backward, her designer heels tangling in the strap of her fallen bag. She hit the glass wall and slid down, weeping hysterically, her hands hovering over her face. Marcus, seeing his golden daughter collapse and his son-in-law restrained, finally snapped out of his stunned paralysis. He buttoned his suit jacket and puffed out his chest, attempting to summon the dominating CEO persona that had intimidated local boardrooms for 30 years. He stepped into the center of the room, projecting his booming voice. "Gentlemen, there has been a massive misunderstanding here," Marcus declared, squaring his shoulders. "I am Marcus Wilson. I am personal friends with the regional director of your agency. This man is an executive at a major financial institution. I demand you release him immediately while I place a call to our legal counsel. We can clear up this paperwork issue like civilized professionals." The federal agents did not even look at him. They treated the blustering patriarch of the Wilson family like a mildly annoying piece of furniture. The lead agent hauled Chad to his feet, roughly patting down his pockets while reading the rest of his Miranda rights. Marcus' face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. The utter disrespect was breaking his fragile mind. He stepped closer, raising his voice to a furious roar. "Did you hear me?" I said. "Unhand him immediately." The second agent finally turned his head, shooting Marcus a look of pure lethal indifference. "Sir, if you interfere with a federal arrest warrant, you will join him in the back of the transport van. Sit down and remain silent." Marcus' mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The grand illusion of his absolute power and respectability shattered instantly into dust. He was not a titan of industry to these men. He was just a loud, aging man in a rented suit standing in a room he did not own, trying to defend a criminal. He slowly backed away, sinking heavily into his leather chair and staring blankly at his trembling hands. The crushing weight of his own irrelevance had finally broken him. The agents jerked Chad toward the heavy conference room doors. Chad dragged his feet, his face pale and slick with sweat, looking back at his wife with wide, terrified eyes. His tailored suit was wrinkled, his tie skewed, his wrists securely bound behind his back. The doors swung open and they marched him out into the lobby, parading him past the staring receptionists and shocked clients. Chloe watched her husband being hauled away like a common criminal. Her perfect suburban fantasy was dead. The offshore accounts were frozen. The stolen money was gone. She turned her head and locked her tear-streaked eyes on me. The sheer volume of hatred radiating from her face was palpable. Her chest heaved as she pushed herself up from the floor, pointing a shaking manicured finger directly at my chest. "You did this," she hissed, her voice vibrating with pure venom. "You destroyed my husband. You destroyed my life. You are a monster, Maya. You are completely dead to me. Do you hear me? You have no family. You are nothing to us." I stood perfectly tall, watching her unravel. I did not raise my voice. I did not match her frantic, hysterical energy. I looked at the ruined makeup smudged beneath her eyes, and the desperate heave of her shoulders, and I felt nothing but a clean, beautiful silence. "I know, Chloe," I said, my voice dropping into a freezing quiet register that commanded the entire room. "I have known that for a very long time, but you need to understand something else. As of 8 o'clock this morning, the escrow accounts Chad was using to launder that money were seized by the federal government. You have no husband, you have no offshore nest egg, and as of today you have no house." Chloe staggered backward, grabbing the edge of the mahogany table for support, as if I had physically struck her. She covered her mouth with both hands, letting out a muffled, agonizing sob. I turned my attention away from my broken sister and looked down at my mother. Bernadette was still on the floor, weeping quietly into her hands, her diamond tennis bracelet glittering under the harsh fluorescent lights. She looked small and pathetic, stripped of the arrogant superiority she had wielded against me since childhood. I reached into my red leather briefcase one final time. I pulled out the third red folder and extracted the crisp legal document drafted by my real estate attorney just hours ago. I walked around the large mahogany table and stood directly over Bernadette. She looked up at me, her mascara running her eyes, begging for a mercy she had never once shown me. I dropped the heavy white envelope onto her lap. It landed with a soft, definitive thud against her silk skirt. "Here is your formal, legally binding 30-day notice of eviction," I said, my voice echoing off the glass walls. "Merry Christmas, Bernadette." I did not wait for her response. I snapped my briefcase shut, turned on my heel, and walked out of the conference room. The sound of my loafers was steady and calm on the polished hardwood floors. I walked down the long corridor toward the elevator, leaving them surrounded by the absolute ruins of the fraudulent empire they had built, leaving them crying in the lobby for everyone to see. Chadwick Montgomery, we have a warrant for your arrest for wire fraud and forgery. The heavy steel handcuffs ratcheted around Chad's wrists with a sharp metallic clack that seemed to echo endlessly against the glass walls. He did not fight back. He simply collapsed inward, his knees buckling as the agents hauled him upright. Chloe snapped out of her paralyzed horror and lunged forward. Her perfectly manicured hands clawed frantically at the lead agent's tactical vest. She let out a guttural, desperate scream demanding they let her husband go. The second agent stepped directly into her path, his hand resting menacingly on his utility belt. He warned her in a voice devoid of any human empathy that one more step would result in her immediate arrest for assaulting a federal officer and obstruction of justice. Chloe shrank back, hitting the edge of the conference table and sliding down to the floor in a weeping mess. Marcus tried to intervene, puffing out his chest and attempting to leverage his manufactured respectability. He name-dropped local politicians and demanded to speak to their supervisor. The agents looked right through him as if he were completely invisible. They dragged Chad toward the exit, his expensive Italian loafers scraping across the polished hardwood. As he disappeared through the double doors, Chloe turned her tear-streaked face toward me. Pure, unadulterated hatred burned in her eyes. "You are dead to me," she hissed, her voice vibrating with venom. "You have no family." I smiled, a cold, freezing expression. "I know," I replied, my tone completely level. "And as of 8 o'clock this morning, you have no house." I turned to Bernadette, who was still sobbing quietly in her chair. I dropped a thick manila envelope directly onto her lap. "Here is your 30-day eviction notice. Merry Christmas." I turned and walked out of the office, leaving them surrounded by the shattered ruins of their own arrogance. The next 30 days played out like a flawlessly executed demolition. The forensic evidence I provided to the federal prosecutors was an impenetrable fortress of data. Chad's bail hearing lasted exactly 14 minutes. The federal judge took one look at the forged real estate documents, the illegal escrow accounts, and the undeniable ties to Apex Holdings and immediately declared him a severe flight risk. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down, echoing with absolute finality. Chad was remanded to federal custody without bail. The polished, arrogant investment banker who had mocked me in my own driveway was stripped of his tailored suits and led out of the courtroom wearing an oversized orange jumpsuit, his wrists and ankles shackled in heavy iron chains. With Chad's assets frozen and the offshore accounts seized by the government, Chloe's meticulously curated life disintegrated overnight. The financial decay was spectacularly rapid. 2 days after the bail hearing, a pair of tow trucks arrived at Chloe's suburban mansion in the middle of the night, dragging away her luxury SUV and Chad's sports car. A week later, the repo men arrived for the rest. They marched through her pristine home, tossing her beloved designer bags, along with her expensive shoes and diamond jewelry, into heavy plastic bins. Chloe tried to leverage her social network, frantically calling her sorority sisters and the affluent women from her country club. Every single call went straight to voicemail. Her perfect life had been exposed as a criminal sham, and the high society circle she worshipped severed all ties instantly to protect their own reputations. Evicted from her foreclosed mansion, and entirely penniless, Chloe was forced to haul her remaining clothes in garbage bags to a cheap roadside motel off the interstate. Her new reality was illuminated by a flickering neon sign and smelled permanently of stale cigarette smoke and cheap industrial bleach. Marcus and Bernadette fared no better. The 30-day eviction clock was ticking down like a bomb, and their desperation turned them reckless. Marcus attempted one final scheme to maintain their aristocratic illusion. He approached the board of directors at their prestigious megachurch, requesting an emergency loan from the congregation's benevolent fund to cover a temporary cash flow issue. He tried to sell them the same manufactured charm he had used to navigate local business circles for decades. Unfortunately for Marcus, the federal investigation into Chad's wire fraud had already made the front page of the local news. The head pastor discovered the undeniable link between Marcus, the forged property deeds, and the impending eviction. The church leadership realized immediately that associating with a family actively engaged in federal fraud would jeopardize their tax-exempt status and destroy their pristine public image. The pastor summoned Marcus and Bernadette to his office and formally excommunicated them, banning them from the church grounds entirely. They were completely cast out of the only social stronghold they had left. When the 30th day finally arrived, there were no professional movers to pack their belongings. Marcus and Bernadette, sweating and exhausted, were forced to load their items into a rented U-Haul truck themselves. Their former neighbors stood on their manicured lawns, watching in silent judgment as the disgraced patriarch and his wife dragged cheap cardboard boxes down the driveway. They drove away from the upscale neighborhood in absolute humiliation, relocating to a tiny cramped apartment on the industrial side of town. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my downtown penthouse, looking out over the glittering city skyline. The silence in my apartment was perfectly peaceful, a sharp contrast to the chaos I had left behind. My cell phone vibrated on the marble kitchen island, breaking the quiet. The screen displayed an incoming call from an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, an audio file appeared. It was Chloe. Her voice was unrecognizable, distorted by ragged, desperate sobbing. She was begging me for a loan, pleading for a second chance, crying that she had nowhere else to turn, and that she finally understood how wrong they had been. I did not listen to the end of the recording. I simply pressed delete, erased the file permanently, and poured myself a glass of vintage red wine. I set the empty crystal wine glass down on the cold marble counter. The deletion of Chloe's voicemail was not just the erasure of an audio file. It was the severing of the final corrupted artery connecting me to the Wilson family. I slept that night with a deep, uninterrupted peace I had never experienced before. When the sun rose the next morning, I initiated the final phase of my plan. It was time to deal with the house. I had absolutely no intention of keeping the sprawling colonial estate. Every square foot of that property was a monument to Bernadette's crushing vanity and Marcus's suffocating arrogance. It was a pristine mausoleum built entirely on appearances and generational toxicity. I refused to let it sit in my asset portfolio like a cursed artifact. I picked up my phone and called Kendra. We had shared a cramped dorm room during our freshman year at Howard University, and she had since clawed her way up to become one of the most formidable luxury real estate brokers in the state. She drove over that same afternoon. We stood in the grand foyer, the echoing silence a stark contrast to the shouting and entitlement that used to fill the space. I handed Kendra the heavy brass keys and gave her a very specific mandate. "I do not want a bidding war," I told her, as we walked through the empty vaulted living room. "I do not want an all-cash offer from a faceless corporate conglomerate looking to flip it. And I absolutely refuse to sell this property to another pretentious country club couple. Find me people who actually deserve a break." Kendra understood the assignment perfectly. She utilized her private network, and 2 weeks later she brought me the perfect buyers. Marcus and Alicia were a young, intensely hardworking Black couple who had been ruthlessly priced out of the housing market for years. He was a dedicated public school history teacher, and she was a pediatric nurse working grueling 12-hour shifts. They were desperate to find a safe, stable neighborhood to start their family. But every time they saved enough for a down payment, the market surged out of their reach. When Kendra brought them for a private viewing, they walked through the opulent rooms with hesitant disbelief. They could not fathom how a house in this zip code was listed at such a price. I had explicitly instructed Kendra to list the property significantly under market value, deliberately pricing it so their pre-approved mortgage would cover it comfortably. I was not looking to maximize my profit margin. I was executing a cleansing. Signing the closing documents a few weeks later felt like a true exorcism. Alicia cried openly at the closing table, repeatedly thanking me, while her husband held her hand tightly. They had no idea about the dark history of the home they were buying. They only saw a beautiful future. I was taking a structure built on vanity and handing it over to a family who would fill it with actual, genuine love. The cycle of trauma in that property was officially and permanently broken. With the real estate handled, I shifted my focus entirely to my career. By late November, the atmosphere in my downtown firm was crackling with electric energy. The massive fallout from Chad's arrest had sent terrifying shockwaves through the financial sector. The federal prosecutors had not just used my forensic dossier, they had essentially used it as the foundational blueprint for their entire sweeping case against Apex Holdings and its shell companies. The sheer, undeniable detail of my financial tracking became industry legend almost overnight. It terrified several major investment firms into immediately conducting their own frantic internal audits. They realized with striking clarity that if a single forensic accountant could unravel a multi-million-dollar laundering scheme in her spare time, they desperately needed that exact level of ruthless expertise to protect their own vulnerable assets. Our firm was suddenly flooded with high-profile retainer requests from clients who wanted the absolute best in the business. On a crisp Tuesday morning, the three senior managing partners called me into the executive boardroom. There was no corporate doublespeak, there was no patronizing hesitation. They treated me with a level of profound professional respect that my own father had denied me for my entire life. The lead partner slid a thick leather-bound contract across the polished mahogany table. They were officially promoting me to senior partner complete with a substantial equity stake in the firm. I had brought them a massive influx of elite clients and revolutionized their forensic division. They were moving aggressively to secure my loyalty before a rival firm could even attempt to poach me. I picked up the heavy brass pen and signed my name with a steady hand. I felt the incredibly satisfying weight of genuine earned success settling over my shoulders. That evening, I walked back into my spacious corner office. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, looking out over the glittering city skyline. Snow was beginning to fall lightly over the busy streets, signaling the official arrival of the holiday season. In years past, this time of year was filled with an overwhelming, suffocating dread. It meant enduring Bernadette's endless backhanded compliments about my wardrobe. It meant sitting through Marcus's overbearing lectures about my career trajectory. It meant shrinking myself to fit into their twisted narrative while Chloe and Chad paraded their stolen wealth. It was a season of performative smiles and quiet humiliation. Now I felt nothing but absolute lightness. I walked over to my desk and closed my laptop with a sharp, satisfying click. The holidays were here, and for the first time in my entire life, I was completely free of the heavy toxic anchor of my family. The tropical sun of Costa Rica beat down on the pristine white sand, a brilliant blinding contrast to the gray slush and biting wind I had left behind in the city. Christmas Day had finally arrived. For the first 34 years of my life, December 25th was a rigid scheduled performance. It was a day measured out in forced pleasantries, perfectly timed photo opportunities, and the heavy oppressive weight of my parents' expectations. It was a day where I was expected to sit at the far end of a massive mahogany dining table, chewing dry turkey and swallowing insults disguised as maternal concern. Not this year. I reclined in a plush cushioned lounger on the private terrace of my five-star cliffside villa. The air was thick with the sweet fragrance of hibiscus and the salty tang of the Pacific Ocean. I wore a flowing emerald silk dress, the lightweight fabric catching the gentle sea breeze and dancing around my ankles. There were no uncomfortable wool sweaters, no suffocating formal wear, no designer heels pinching my feet to appease Bernadette's arbitrary country club dress codes. I was barefoot, my toes resting lightly against the smooth, sun-warmed teakwood of the deck. In my right hand, I held a tall crystal glass filled with a vibrant mixture of fresh passion fruit rum and a squeeze of lime. The condensation beaded on the outside of the glass, cool and refreshing under the equatorial sun. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the tart sweetness wash over my tongue. I listened to the rhythmic, hypnotic crashing of the surf against the volcanic rocks below. The sound was incredibly peaceful, completely drowning out the lingering echoes of Marcus' booming lectures and Chloe's high-pitched complaints. I closed my eyes and let the absolute serenity of the moment wash over me. The contrast between my current reality and the wreckage I had left in my wake was staggering. I imagined the freezing temperatures up north, I pictured Marcus and Bernadette shivering in their cramped, poorly insulated apartment, staring at a miniature artificial tree because they could no longer afford the towering imported evergreens they used to boast about. I pictured Chloe huddled in a dingy motel room, listening to the roar of highway traffic instead of Christmas carols. I pictured Chad eating processed cafeteria food off a metal tray in a federal holding facility surrounded by concrete and razor wire. They had spent decades treating me like an inconvenient shadow. They had mocked my career choices, belittled my lifestyle, and actively conspired to steal the one piece of security I had managed to build for myself. They believed their sheer arrogance and manufactured social standing would protect them from the consequences of their actions. They had been spectacularly wrong. I had not just survived their treachery. I had weaponized my intelligence and dismantled their entire fraudulent empire brick by pristine brick. A sudden soft vibration against the wooden table next to my lounger pulled me out of my thoughts. I opened my eyes and glanced over. My cell phone, which I had kept on silent for the past 48 hours, was glowing brightly in the shade of the canvas umbrella. A new text message notification hovered on the lock screen. The sender was listed as an unknown number. I picked up the device, staring at the 10 digits. It was a local area code from back home, a prepaid number, a burner phone. My parents' cellular service had been terminated weeks ago when their accounts were frozen, and the carrier realized the bills would never be paid. The message contained only 2 short sentences. "We have nothing. How can you be happy?" The sheer, unadulterated narcissism radiating from those 8 words was breathtaking. Even now, stripped of her mansion, her jewelry, her social standing, and her golden son-in-law, Bernadette was entirely incapable of self-reflection. She was sitting in absolute ruin, and her primary concern was still my emotional state. She could not fathom how the daughter she had deemed worthless was thriving, while her own perfect world had collapsed. She wanted me to feel guilty. She wanted me to absorb her misery, to lower myself back into the darkness, so she would not have to suffer alone. She still believed that my happiness was an affront to her existence. I stared at the glowing screen, reading the desperate, pathetic words one more time. I felt no surge of anger. My heart rate did not elevate. My hands did not shake. The emotional triggers that my mother had installed and manipulated since my childhood had been completely, permanently disabled. I felt nothing but a cool, clinical amusement. I unlocked the phone and tapped the reply field. I did not write a paragraph explaining my success. I did not list the crimes she had committed or the betrayals she had orchestrated. I did not waste a single ounce of my hard-earned peace trying to make her understand the justice of the situation. She would never understand. She was fundamentally incapable of seeing anyone but herself. I typed my response with steady, deliberate strokes. "I bought my own seat at the table. Enjoy the Uber." I hit send. I did not wait for the delivery confirmation. I immediately tapped the settings menu, selected block caller, and erased the text thread. With a final satisfying motion, I held down the power button and watched the screen go completely black. The phone was dead silent. I tossed the useless piece of metal and glass into my woven beach bag. It landed with a soft thud buried beneath my sunscreen and a paperback novel. I stood up from the lounger, the silk dress flowing beautifully around my legs. I walked to the edge of the terrace and descended the private wooden staircase that led directly to the secluded beach. The pristine white sand was incredibly warm against my bare feet. The tropical sun wrapped around my shoulders like a comforting blanket. I walked toward the shoreline, my eyes fixed on the endless expanse of turquoise water stretching out to the horizon. There were no boundaries out there. There were no glass ceilings, no mahogany tables, no forged documents, and no toxic anchors dragging me down. I reached the edge of the water and let the gentle foaming tide wash over my feet, cooling my skin and washing away the last invisible traces of the Wilson family. I stood there breathing in the clean, salty air, a self-made woman entirely in control of her own magnificent destiny. The silence of the ocean was perfect. I was finally completely and beautifully free.